Welcome to a special episode of This Week in HPC with Intersect 360 Research, distributed by HPC Wire. I'm Addison Snell with Intersect 360 Research, and this week in HPC, we're doing something new with our first ever video panel episode of the podcast. Those of you listening to this podcast through our normal audio channels on iTunes and SoundCloud can find the complete video on the Intersect 360 Research YouTube channel, along with coverage on HPC Wire. We've adopted this video format today because of an important issue as we look at the topic of racism in America, specifically as it pertains to high-performance computing. For this panel, I'm honored to be joined by 5 prominent African Americans representing leadership roles from across the HPC community who are here to share their personal opinions and experiences, not necessarily those of their organizations. Jim Ganthier is a Senior Vice President at Dell Technologies. As a seasoned executive with an engineering background and 14 patents, Jim has led HPC strategies and solutions for both Dell and HPE, the top 2 HPC system vendors by worldwide revenue. He was one of HPC Wire's People to Watch in 2016, and in 2019, Jim was named one of the top 10 blacks in technology by the Austin Black Business Journal. Jim, thanks for being with me on the panel today.
My pleasure to be here, and I'm looking forward to our conversations along with the other panelists.
Thank you, Jim. William Burke is a senior HPC system engineer at George Washington University. His 15 years in HPC technical roles crosses industry, government, and academia in multiple fields. His experience spans the NIH and industrial roles across pharmaceuticals, genomics, and financial services. William has a master's degree in information technology from Harvard University. William, I'm really glad you're with us this morning.
Happy to be here.
Dr. Valerie Taylor is the Director of Mathematics and Computer Science Division at Argonne National Laboratory, where her research is in the field of performance analysis and modeling of parallel scientific applications. She's also the Executive Director of CMDIT, the Center for Minorities and People with Disabilities in Information Technology. Valerie previously held CS leadership roles at Texas A&M and Northwestern Universities. She earned her PhD in electrical engineering and computer science from UC Berkeley. Valerie, thanks for being with me on this video panel.
Thank you, Addison. I'm happy to be here and look forward to the discussion.
Tony Baylis is the Director of the Office of Strategic Diversity and Inclusion Programs for Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. Tony began his career at NCSA at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, where he earned his degree. In addition to his role at LLNL, Tony has served in student outreach roles for the SC Conference Series. He's the Diversity and Inclusion Chair for ACM SIGGRAPH, and he's a board member for the Empower Her Institute. Tony, I'm thrilled that you're with us. Thanks.
Thank you, Addison, for inviting me to be on this panel. I'm very pleased to be here today. So thank you.
Thank you. And finally, Dr. Jessie BEM Lee is a lecturer at Bowie State University and the Director of Joint Educational Facilities, introducing parallel and advanced computing techniques to inner-city high school and college students. As National Education Chairperson for Black Data Processing Associates, he helped to introduce the BDPA High School Computer Competition, which today has over 20 participating teams from chapters across the country. Under the BDPA, the Dr. Jessie BEM Lee Scholarship Program facilitates the emergence of minority youth into the technology industry. Jessie, it's great to see you again. Thanks for being with me on this panel.
It's great to be here, Addison. You'll find that I do a lot more listening than I do talking.
Well, I'll call on you when we're ready, Jessie. All right. Thank you all for being here. I'm excited about talking about this very important issue. And for our first topic today, I want to go right to the obvious, which is that Blacks are dramatically underrepresented in our industry. As an HPC analyst, I do not have, nor have I ever seen any official numbers on racial inclusion in HPC at a community level. But if I were asked my analyst estimate, I'd say that the HPC community is about 1% Black within the US, and if less, if restricted to technical roles in science or engineering. And I'd like to just ask, can each of you talk to me about your own experiences as a Black person in the HPC community in the US, and in what ways you may have experienced racism in your career, whether it was overt or subtle or individual or systemic. Jim, I'd like to start with you. Why don't you go ahead?
Well, first of all, that was we'll call it a pretty stunning statistic, because if we look at the IT industry in general, Blacks make up roughly 8%, at least available on public websites, which obviously doesn't match the anywhere between 18 to 22% of the general population. So having said that, yes, not only very underrepresented, but let's just say that there are some hurdles that most of us have had to traverse. I'll give you some perfect examples. I'm sure everybody on the panel has had the phrase or something along the lines of, wow, that was really smart, or wow, you are really eloquent. That may not sound like much, but if you step back and think about it, it's almost as if, well, maybe you shouldn't be, or maybe, I'm surprised that you are. So that's a version of a subtle scenario. And by the way, I know this is mostly a US topic of conversation, but I've walked into a room where I've had members of my staff, and because of the last name that I have, which is a very European last name, people have literally like brushed right by me and went to shake the hand of someone who doesn't look like me, and they automatically assumed, because of both position and last name, who that individual was. So yes, I mean, over my 25-ish year career, I've never had anything really overt, but there's just been a lot of subtle things that have occurred that make you kind of sit there and go, Now, in most cases, when that has occurred, I have the type of personality where I've addressed it in a very polite, professional fashion, but not everybody does that.
You brought up a good point, Jim, that we're talking about America here specifically. Now, this doesn't mean that racism is, of course, a global problem. We're talking about the US today for two reasons. One is to narrow the focus, because what racism in Japan or China might look very different than what racism looks like in the United States. And more to the point, this is what's topical in the news cycle. This is an acute issue in America right here, right now. William, I'd like to come to you next, because you've got experience that spans a lot of different types of organizations as a senior HPC leader. And when I was talking to you before, you had an experience, I think, that was quite similar to Jim's.
Yeah, that is true. I can certainly relate to coming into a room and also because of my last name, first and last name. And I have a sort of, I've had a situation where I worked with a guy for about a year. We never actually met. We had a virtual team, and this particular day, we were to meet the team, and he comes in. So we basically have a 9 o'clock meeting, and he comes in 20 minutes late. He's got the raincoat and is raining outside. He shakes off the umbrella. He sits down. He basically knows everyone else, but we had never met. And so he looks around the room and he says, "Hey, where's William? Is he late?" And everyone sort of turns and looks at me, and and I'm senior to the project, and so he realized quickly, and it's pretty subtle, and he says, "Oh, William, I didn't see you." And so I said, "Oh, I've been sitting here all along." And so these are sort of the subtleties that we kind of have to face at some point in time. And some people might have taken it in a negative way. I have a way of being able to, address it in such a way that it's, looking at it from a perspective of, it could be an honest mistake, but these are things that you actually have to deal with. And then what was interesting is that we did kind of talk about it a little bit later. And then he says to me, he said, my God, I've been speaking with you a whole year, and in my mind, I pictured you as this white guy. And so it was really interesting topic that we had. And it was educational from the perspective of, I asked him, I said, well, what does a black guy sound like? So that's one of many experiences. So.
I'm going to come to Jessie BEM Lee next. This is something that you've addressed specifically with a lot of young people in your career. Where do you see this both in your path and in the path of those you help?
So let me first tell you about my incident. I was the person who was the lead person in database management systems at DEA back during the 80s. And we were subject to the Department of Justice. So we had a big meeting down at the Department of Justice. I took my team down there and we were supposed to have some information transferred. And all the questions were directed to my team. And most of my team was white. And so most of the questions were directed to the white boys. And they answered the question, but every time they came to a point where they didn't have the answer, they had to defer to me, and they did. And after we left, the white boys weren't happy about that, but I told them, don't worry about that. We accomplished the mission. That's foremost in my mind. And so,
this is an area where I'd like to think that science, engineering, HPC ought to be a meritocracy, right? Where just the best ideas start floating to the top. But it sounds like you're saying that's not always true, Jessie.
No, that's not always true. That's not always true at all. And you know, since I initially talked to you about this, there are a lot of things that have been floating around in my head. And having been around for a long time, about 76 years, I've seen a lot of things happen. And I say that most of what the problem that we're having has to do with all of the resources flowing in one direction. And then when those people that are resource rich need us, there's a little trickle down effect. Let's just take computing in general. When I was in undergraduate school, computing was, well, a computer was a person who computes. And we were using those big calculators. And, you know, we didn't think about those big machines, that kind of thing. And so when the computer industry matured somewhat, the big white schools got them. In order for the black schools to have any kind of computational capability, what they did was they would put a leased line into a black school and a terminal on the end of that leased line. So there was no computation going on at the black school. It was all done at the white school.
And I think to many listeners who might hear white schools, black schools, and think maybe we're past that, but you're at Bowie State University, which is the oldest historically black college or university in the state of Maryland. And I think part of the conversation today has to be what our industry is doing together with the HBCUs in this country. I'm going to move on to Tony and Valerie, both of whom are at major U.S. supercomputing sites. Tony, where are you on this topic, and where have you seen this in your career?
I've seen it mostly in my conversations with students. I've been very, I would say, blessed, just based on the fact of coming in to an environment at the University of Illinois at the National Center for Supercomputing Applications. So where I've had Dr. Larry Smarr, Dr. Mike Norman, you know, Dr. Ed Seidel, and James Bottom, Maxine Brown, Tom DeFonte, and Dr. Valerie Taylor sitting here be really sort of mentors to me in this space. And as a result, I've been somewhat included. Although I didn't necessarily feel like I would belong in some areas, especially unfortunately at our supercomputing conference, even though the people there did work to make me feel that way, I was usually one of the few. Valerie and I were out there as one of the only. But what I've heard though from the students that are still today in 2020, they're talking about this issue that they are not treated as if they belong in this sort of area. And they see it from faculty, they see it from the system itself, the institution, educational system, that they're not basically, as Jessie had put, given the opportunities. They don't even know about HPC. The awareness isn't really there in a lot of historically Black colleges and universities, and quite frankly, Hispanic serving institutions as well. So MSIs across the board, unless there is a intentional effort at that particular university, or they have a faculty member who they've recruited who has a research interest in that space. And they do all the sort of lifting of, putting people in that space. But, the students themselves say that they're not, they face some of this racism that you talk about. I came into it late, and I like I said, I've been very, very lucky to have wonderful stewards and mentors in the HPC arena for me.
Some of what you're talking about is a subtle and maybe even unintentional problem where here's me as a white man in some senior position in HPC, and someone says to me, senior HPC executive in some role. And in my head, I haven't met this person yet, but I'm picturing, first of all, a man, and second of all,
Right.
a white man. And it's just sort of situational. And that's been really related to the stories that you're all bringing to the table. Valerie, I didn't mean to really see you, put you all the way to the end. You've been very patient waiting for this.
Oh, the best is always last.
I'm very interested in what you have to say here. Go ahead, Valerie.
And so I will say, especially as a Black woman, I think when the numbers are low, the question that comes up has to do with the mental model and the assumptions that people have about, occupations, about careers. And I would say especially too in HPC, because for example, with myself as a faculty member, I would go places with grad students. And one time I went someplace with a white female grad student. And when the two of us walked in the room, they went to her and said, how are you doing, Professor Taylor? And she was like, no, you can't say that. And I was like, it's okay. It's okay. Even, moving to Argonne, with the bank that I was working with, we never met, but they knew the position and they knew the salary. And so they said, I'll help you. And they filled out the forms and filled out demographic information. So they filled out the demographic information as female, white. So it has to do with the assumptions that people make and how they act on those assumptions, instead of getting to know a person and giving people the benefit of the doubt. I think, that becomes a major issue.
One last thing I definitely want to hit on before we move off of this topic is a phrase that came up in one of our preliminary conversations. William, I was talking to you and you were talking about affirmative action and said, I'm a product of affirmative action. Can you recap some of your experience in that regard?
Yeah. So when I said that, I was saying that I'm a product of affirmative action, and so is my mother, and so is my father. And I think it had it definitely had a positive effect. However, as time has gone on, there's been situations where I felt like I was part of a quota system, where say they had to hire 100 people, and they're looking and said, oh my God, we have only 3 Blacks here and we need 4.5. So we need to go and find 2 more bodies. I don't want to be, that person or have someone that's being hired because of, just because of that. But I think that, diversity means a lot of things, and inclusivity, and diversity embraces that unique contributions of members of a community. And we've got to start to look at what that means. It doesn't mean having many Black faces in the room, or even women faces in the room, or the multiplicity of minority faces. The change has to come within the policies and the practices, and to be quite frank, the mindset. We just kind of spoke about some of those subtleties of what you kind of think about, when you think about an executive, or when you think about that, that lead engineer, what comes to mind is, it's typically usually, first choice is, like you said, a male, but not even just a male, a white male. So if people are thinking along those lines, we have to, there has to be a way of being able to have people to open up and kind of look otherwise, and when they made and so, like, for instance, there was a push to, to embrace women in a lot of the leadership roles. There was a conscious effort to go after and push for women in leadership roles. So I would say the same thing for Blacks as a minority, to be able to embrace and Blacks in terms of, we do have our opinions, and I think diversity is about the willingness to accept, those types of divergent opinions, and so that it allows us to have a better realization of what our environment is, and not that it's just, sort of this one, sort of this one standard, and one standard and one potential direction to go, that we embrace that diversity.
And Jim, you just very quickly wrapping up this topic, you're coming from the corporate side, and you were talking to me about the importance of that diversity of thought, and that it goes beyond the problem William's describing, where even once he's in the organization, he can feel like other people are looking at him thinking, oh, you're the token we had to hire. And the benefit of having diversity of thought in an organization and how you make better decisions.
Yeah, so just to give a couple of facts and data points. I mean, if we look at where the world is headed, if we look at the number of folks that we're going to need in STEM, if we don't start hiring more diverse talent, we're going to be short by about 1.6 to 1.8 million, depending on how you want to do the math. The second thing that we found, when I say we, obviously this is now top of mind for many other execs at a lot of other high-tech companies, diversity of thought, diversity of people actually is good for business. I mean, I won't go into specific examples, but having folks who can look at things in a different way, having folks who have had a different background, not only makes the products, offers, solutions, supercomputers that much more, we'll call it innovative, but in some cases, that's how the true breakthrough happens. So whether we want to look at it as an industry problem, whether we want to look at it as an impending scenario that we categorically have to go solve, or if you want to just look at it as quote unquote good business in terms of innovation and driving new thought processes, new approaches, and new ways to do things, all of those are items that makes this not just a very topical conversation, but a very important conversation right now. One thing I do want to highlight a little bit of is, I was resonating with a lot of what William had mentioned. Sometimes it's not hiring because of the person, but just getting that system kickstarted. I know an executive at one particular high-tech firm, and very similar to what Tony mentioned. He said, "Look, you need to come up with 4 people that you want to mentor," and he had everybody write those names down on a list. And then he said, "Okay, out of the 4 people, how many are female, and how many are represented? If you don't have at least 1 or 2 on the list, you're obviously not doing something well as a leader." So it's not you hire because of, but at least start to look at the consideration set, at least make it part of the initial process. Because like a flywheel, until you do that up front, the wheel never starts to spin and progress doesn't get made.
We often talk about supercomputing in general as solving the world's toughest problems. And I want to raise an interesting question here, because when we talk about racism, to me, this is getting into world's toughest problems. Now, the other major news story this year has been the global pandemic, and I noticed that we're all very fast to get into the conversation about what can supercomputing do to battle COVID-19, modeling its spread, looking for viruses, all the molecular modeling. Now, here's this other major news story about racism and the state of race relations in America, which strikes me as a world's toughest problem. Can HPC in of itself, maybe with the broader aspects of data science or big data or machine learning and AI, can this scope of high performance computing potentially help address systemic racism in modeling for it, in controlling for it? I don't know, should someone ask? I'd like to start with the major supercomputing centers here. Valerie, do you have a perspective on this?
Yes, I think in terms of, as you mentioned, with HPC and solving some of the world's, grand challenge problems, I think if we look at systemic racism as a grand challenge problem to be solved, and that is along multiple dimensions. So one, I think one area that's on everyone's minds right now has to do with policing and, injustices and racial injustices. And so I think if we start to have, for example, look at it as a data problem in terms of, looking at, in terms of police brutality, recognize it as data and make that data available, make that data in terms of looking at trends. You can look at trends around different areas, different cities, regions as to what's going on. You can also have the data available such that when you have issues arise, it's not where, for example, someone can go from one region to another region because you have data available that's been analyzed, you have some anomalies. We're very good with different systems of identifying extreme events, identifying trends, identifying those anomalies. We can look at that, especially in terms of police reform. I think another area that has to do with HPC, and this I think has to do more in terms of engagement, and that is HPC is a very exciting field. And I think as we talk among ourselves and we talk about the excitement and what we're doing and the problems that we're working on and how we're solving some of society's major problems, whether that's, COVID-19 and the pandemic, whether we're looking at energy, we're looking at solving, let's say, cancer treatment, but oftentimes we don't convey that excitement to K through 12. We keep it among ourselves and talking, we're great, but we need to go out and figure out ways to convey that to K through 12, especially looking at high school, looking at undergrads, to have excitement also about the field of HPC. So I think it's, circular, and that is HPC helping to solve some of the problems having to do with racial injustices, but also looking at HPC as more engagement too in STEM and more engagement in the field. And for that, I really want to commend Jessie, because I know for many, many years, that's Jessie's passion is with the K through 12. And he's been doing that for many years. And if you look at, and I just have to say, if you look at where the students go in Jessie's program, it's phenomenal in terms of going into STEM. So I commend you, Jessie, for the many years.
Well, let's go to Jessie next then. Since you were just calling them up there, we're talking about trying to solve this. Jessie, what do you think the role is of HPC in trying to solve the problem?
Okay, the role
Yes.
of HPC and K-12 is just to be what I would consider a resource to get the young people familiar with. And what I was doing was not so much as teaching them, how to be researchers and all that type of thing. What I was doing was just introducing
Yes.
to them so that they would have a familiarity. And let me just give you an instance of when they were having the cluster competition where where a team would take a node of the cluster, put it in the rack, configure it, hook it up, and make it be a part of that cluster. Well, we had a high school student who was an 11th grader, and I was trying to reach him so that I could figure out which conference that was. That was an SC conference. And he was this competition was open to high school all the way up through professionals. And he was leading everybody in terms of getting all this done. He lost his lead because he was not familiar with the I/O interconnects, those interfaces. I mean, we had nothing like that at Joint Educational Facilities in DC. I mean, we just barely had RJ45 interfaces. And so by the time he figured out how to get it interfaced, he had lost his lead. Other than that, he would have won that competition, a high school student competing initially with everybody.
And you are doing excellent work introducing parallel and advanced computing at the high school and college level, the K through 12 level. I want to come back to this idea of HPC addressing systemic racism. Tony, you've been at a couple of major supercomputing sites. Valerie seemed for it. If we just take the notion of we've got data, someone ought to be able to do an application here. Do you agree?
100%. I think the areas where HPC can actually lend itself to assisting with this systemic and institutional problem is solving that on the data front. We can do visualizations that actually, she talked about the modeling as well on that. I mean, if you go back to just look at the historical nature of things, the redlining that happened, way back when, and we do some analysis on that redlining and basically show that there was a causality of what we basically are experiencing today and why that is, it's true. I mean, there's research papers on this. There's research papers studying the police brutality that Valerie talked about. In fact, one was just in August 2019 that was produced that talked about it from ethnicity, gender, and all of those pieces, and age as well. All of those things are things that could be studied more, and using high performance computing systems to do that work from a data science perspective would probably influence us to see inside that a little bit more as to, okay, what can we do? At least we've got the data and the information. What are some of the things that we can move forward with ideas to try to help us sort of mitigate and hopefully erase what we're seeing today?
Where does that responsibility lie? Is that a DOE supercomputing lab problem? Is it NSF? Is it an academic kind of problem? Who should run it?
I think everybody should be coming to the table to solve this problem, because it's not a one problem versus one institution versus the other. Everybody need to be a part of the solution, and just what we're saying, what you're seeing in the Black Lives Matter movement in general. Basically everybody is saying enough is enough. We all have to solve this. We all have to be a part of the solution moving forward. And, unless you have that, you're going to keep having these sort of little pitfalls and these hiccups along the road that you basically are going. It's just not going to, it's going to keep going. And I think if we don't get a good majority at the very least at the table, so DOE, industry, all of us, academia should be involved in solving this. And it is a grand challenge, quite frankly, because it is global as well, as you had cited earlier.
Oh, yes. And William, I'm very interested quickly in your perspective on this, because you've done those different roles, managing HPC clusters of various sizes in industry, at the NIH, at GW now. where do you see this fit? Is this a sort of an application that you could see fitting into the workloads that you've encountered?
Yeah, from an application standpoint, I mean, there's certainly, you know, there's certainly use of HPC and AI tools to combat racism. But one of the things we have to look at, you know, it doesn't work inside of a vacuum. And so what I mean by that, I'll just kind of talk about something that's really relatively low tech. You know, there's this YouTube, I think it's a YouTube video. Yeah, I think it's called Racist Soap Dispenser. And what they discovered was that in the programming of the algorithm, it didn't seem, these soap dispensers initially didn't seem to work for Black people. So the way how the IR worked was that it would send out, you know, it would send out this light signal. And if you had lighter skin or white skin, it would reflect back. But if you had darker skin, it would absorb. And so it's amazing to me that with something as low tech as that, no one actually thought about, you know, the range of complexions. So we have to be careful about how we apply and who is creating these algorithms, so that we have the, you know, when it comes to HPC applications, they're much more complex. And then there was also another case where the Xbox, I think it was Kinect, and when it first came out, it didn't recognize Black people. So it was really interesting that, yeah, we can certainly utilize technology, you know, technology to combat racism, but we have to pay attention to those that are actually programming and creating the applications, because they can have their biases too.
Jim, this really gets back to something you were talking about with regard to the diversity of experience in programming. We're talking about setting up AI algorithms, and if it's all white people or all men who are writing the algorithms, does that set us up for trouble?
Well, actually, it kind of does. I mean, I joke sometimes that technology is like fire. It can be used for good, or it could be used for bad. So the net is that if we want to use a good example, and this kind of resonates with everything the other panelists have talked about, we're doing some early work with some schools. I mean, in order to, you know, my humble belief, solve systemic racism, you got to look at it as a system. So we're looking at which kids are going into particular STEM programs. We're analyzing why are they falling out. We're doing some predictive and proactive things in terms of, hey, look, are their grades dropping? Is their attendance going down? In some cases, have they registered family issues? All of that will help fix it on the front end. But similar to what William mentioned, you know, at the end of the day, HPC is a computational type device. The magic is the algorithms. The algorithms are programmed by human beings. Those human beings don't look like a lot of us on the panel. So this implicit bias is actually being placed in the algorithms. We had the honor of having Dr. Joy Balmawini from MIT come have a conversation with us about 6 or 7 months ago. And her entire conversation, very similar to what William highlighted, was the implicit bias built into facial recognition. So it either doesn't recognize people of color, I mean brown or yellow, or in some cases it falsely recognizes. So the net is that can HPC help in some of these grand problems? Categorically, but we just need to make sure that as we're applying it properly, we're applying it to everybody, and we're making sure that we're not building in some of these things that we as human beings are programming into the systems, because at scale, it would not be good for anyone.
What a big topic that we've been addressing here is that the Black Americans are dramatically underrepresented in the HPC community. So what I want to really get around to as our final big topic is, what does it take to bring about change in this space? And I'll start with Jessie here, because Joint Educational Facilities has been trying to do exactly this work in terms of bringing more minorities up in technology roles. Jessie, what's your role there? About what additional resources are needed, and what would progress look like here in the medium to long term if it's working?
Well, what I'm seeing is us making massive resources available to people down in the K-12 level. But we have to train these people in order to use these resources. When Sputnik went up, it scared the bejeebers out of us. And Kennedy vowed that we were going to catch up and pass them. And so what happened? There was massive amounts of money put into the STEM discipline. I'm the benefit of some of that money as a mathematician back in those days. And so I thought that was going to happen when we had the AI expert system surge during the 90s, but it didn't. I think that that's what we need to do. We need to put massive amounts of resources out there, money, facilities, that type of thing. And then start identifying people to man those, well, before we put the resources out there, identify people to use those resources and to man those facilities, and to start at the elementary school level and interact with folks at all those segments of the pipeline.
Tony, you're wearing an SC conference shirt, and I take note that the SC conference is the biggest event in our industry every year in the U.S. Now, we don't know, with the COVID-19 pandemic, we don't know if we're going to be in person in Atlanta or not. But my concern is protests happen, people get tired, the news cycle moves on. By the time we get to November, what should we be talking? Should this be a topic at SC? What more needs to be done? How do we carry this conversation forward and include in that, what does progress look like in this industry? What should people be doing?
I think what we can do at SC is first, we need to invite those that are in that particular community in Atlanta, because there is a breadth of people and schools in Atlanta that we could tap into and invite them to the table as much as possible. The other thing is that I don't think this is going to be done this time around. I think this conversation is going to continue. And I also believe that we should have some, either whether it be roundtables or panel discussions at supercomputing around this topic that involves industry academic institutions as well as government institutions, to have conversations about actionable steps that we're going to take together to basically run this sort of pathway to understand, here's what you're doing, here's what you're doing. Can we bring these things together? Because oftentimes, and you do need to do this, you have everyone basically doing their things, but they overlap somewhat. Can we tie some of that work together perhaps? How can we make this a system to basically help us mitigate the problems of institutional racism? All right, can we do that? Because, Dell, Intel's, all of those folks of the world are basically putting efforts and money toward these sort of areas. But can we tie this together somehow? Can we have conversations about that speak to what Jessie is talking about, to help K-12, to help more college students, to partner with academia even more in this space? And there's folks that have been doing it. Now, I would even say we should be inviting people from the nonprofit even to that arena as well. All right, because they can help us basically bring that awareness about for the young people that we need to reach, because there are young people out there who just don't know and they're curious. They're using a computer every day with their cell phone. So with that said, they just want to know how it ticks. Some of them do. Some of them just want to play, and that's okay. That's what being a child is all about. But that also sort of creates that curiosity and that enthusiasm that, as soon as you bring it to them, that they can create apps and things of that nature, they'll have a wonderful, wonderful time of just exploring. The only example I'll give you is that, we had a program where we basically reached out to historically Black colleges from our laboratory. And I have a young man from South Carolina, rural South Carolina. He built a 11 node cluster out of Raspberry Pis himself. He learned it. And then he basically created a actual, we call it the Lego Pi. He created Lego Pi so we can teach young people, because he said, if I had this, and he basically did a pilot with kids from his middle school, where he went in rural South Carolina. And as a result of that, we're basically rolling out those Raspberry Pis, and having the HBCUs use those to teach young people. So to get them excited about it. So if you do certain things a lot about that, I like that, I should say, that will be helpful. And having role models, because he was a role model for them, because he came from where they came from. Those things are important. So I'm sorry I went on a little bit longer, but I get very passionate.
Well, he
about this
sounds like
space.
someone with bright job prospects in this space. Valerie, I'll come to you. What's your call to action here? How would you like to see this conversation evolve, and specific action items?
So I think a couple of things just to leverage too with Tony and Jessie, and that is, we talk about intentionality, and I think that is so important.
Correct.
And I think recognizing with this momentum that it's a long-term, effort that we have to put in place. And so being intentional about a long-term effort. There are actionable items that we can do in the recruiting area, but I want to bring up the area about environments. And that is, once you get people in the door, you also want to have people stay at places or stay engaged in an HPC. And so I just want to spend a few minutes talking about environments, because I think that is so important. We talk about training, but one aspect I want to bring up is that having to go back to assumptions that people make and mental models that people have in terms of the assumptions you make from the first time you see a person. And one time I attended this one training that had to do with privilege. And oftentimes people talk about white privilege, and that's along the racial dimension. With this particular training, she presented 30 different dimensions having to do with where you went to school, where you live, all of these aspects, such that at the end of the day, everybody has privilege along some particular dimensions. So if you start to look at people and individuals and Blacks to say, let me get to know you and get to know your background, not make assumptions, then when you start to look at the environment, you start to move in the direction of an inclusive environment, because people have a lot to contribute, and having people at the table contribute and being heard is so important. And that has to do, I want to go back to also what William and Jim talked about. When you start to talk about HPC applications, having people at the table looking at also the data that you have as well as the algorithms. So I just want to spend some time just to emphasize the environment that people are working in becomes so important, and looking at it as a long-term issue that we need to continue this dialogue annually, quarterly, looking at accountability, how we're doing, and having metrics and mechanisms in place to track it.
William, you've been at a couple of different types of HPC organizations in a senior technical role. From that viewpoint, what should change look like here? What's an individual viewer or listener to this podcast? How should they be behaving differently?
Very good question. I'll kind of talk about when I first got into HPC back in 2002, about 18 years ago. I was at Oak Ridge, and it was a program that I got involved with, an internship. And one of the things that I liked about it was that it was very nurturing, and the mentors there, were heavily vested. And I noticed that across the board, not just within our program, but with many programs. So I think mentorship is very, very important. Having people vested, I think that organizations, even for-profit companies, to have those types of programs in place. And as Valerie said, being able to look at people for who they are, because there has to be a willingness to acknowledge or validate people, and even if they are a little different than what you normally see, it has to be a nurturing environment. And so I remember first going on Oak Ridge National Laboratory's campus and just being overwhelmed. Now, I had some engineering background. I started off in the computer industry, computer engineering. So it wasn't all new to me, but it was just like fantastic, because it was like, hey, this is where the world's at that time, the world's fastest computer, supercomputer was. And then it's starting to meet people who, who were really, really smart, who are willing to share. So I think more of that needs to be seen, and not just at the governmental labs, but just across the board, whether it be for-profit companies and nonprofit companies. I think that we need to see industry and academia work hand in hand, bringing more and more of the STEM programs, and not just not just looking specifically for underrepresented group, but to really have an investment. Because with diversity, I think with corporations, if you put it in terms of economics, in terms of financials, and you show the benefits, I think it will move the needle towards that social justice. And that's what I'd like to see moving forward.
All right, I'm going to go to Jim and wrap up then. William was just talking about industry, and you're on the industry side. You're not necessarily speaking for your organizations, but to you, what does this look like going forward? How should this change? What are the action items for our industry?
Well, I mean, my fellow panelists have said it really well. If we want to call it, pick your favorite, institutional, or in some cases, systemic racism, we're going to have to look at it as a system. We're going to have to look at it as a life cycle, because even things that, we grew up with may or may not be applicable. Love the idea of, Jessie talking about how to get this into the K through 12, but here's the fun stuff. A lot of folks in tech and a lot of companies in tech may no longer require a 4-year degree. Some of our partners / co-opetition are starting to look at folks who not only have 2-year degrees, some of them they're hiring directly out of high school, and some of them collectively we're setting up an apprentice. So we've got to start them young. We got to get them into a STEM program. We got to get them excited about, here are some of the world's biggest problems that you can potentially not only be a part of, but help solve. Mm-hmm. That once they do get into a STEM-like program, we help them. We help them with things such as, and the digital divide is very real, we give them access to the right types of tools and the right types of training. We may want to look at something, and again, I'm thinking about the larger industry. A lot of folks in industry are now working with historically Black colleges. A lot of folks are also working what we call MSIs, which is minority serving institutions. I happen to have had the conversation with one of the largest graduator of underrepresented STEM on the East Coast yesterday. But it's not just getting them in, excited, trained, and on board. It's once they actually get into industry, and Dr. Taylor was highlighting this very well. How do you give them a nurturing environment where they not only can do their best work, they can bring their authentic selves, they can be the innovative types of folks we're looking for, they can collaborate across the companies, and how do we build ecosystems where they stay? I'm not going to go through any particular company's data, but you can look at it very well. If you look at underrepresented, we'll call it underrepresentation, somewhere between years 3 to 8, They typically fall out of companies that they don't feel comfortable with. So how do you build a sponsorship, mentorship, nurturing component? Then ultimately, how do you help move them into senior leadership? Because again, this is a longer term play. We don't want to be looking back 5 years from now and saying, well, the number hasn't budged, or better yet, there really aren't a lot of folks, not just at the bottom of the pyramid, but all the way through the pyramid. I mean, folks want to be able to look up a corporate ladder and see folks that look like them. They also want to be able to look across governments and do the same. So we're going to have to look at this not just long term, we're going to have to look at this systemically, and we're going to have to go after every single one of those points where we either have a fallout point or where we end up losing individual only because we didn't make them feel comfortable, calm, and to some extent being able to bring their authentic and best selves to work every day, because that's where the real innovation happens.
I'd like to thank my panelists, Jim Ganthier from Dell, William Burke from George Washington, Valerie Taylor from Argonne, Tony Baylis from Lawrence Livermore, and Jessie BEM Lee from Bowie State. Thank you for taking the time to allow me to hear your perspectives on this crucial topic. I hope it won't be too long before we can all see each other in person again at an HPC community event. I'm Addison Snell with Intersect 360 Research, and thanks to you, our listeners and viewers, for tuning in.